Hello, everyone. Welcome into another episode of Bull Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. My name is Alex, as always, and we are here to talk about training camp a week out. Pretty much at this point, I think the rookies report on the 12th, and then we have the veterans that are reporting next week, and then the festivities kick off on Thursday. So I thought what I'd do in this video is lay out a couple of the training camp situations, scenarios, that storylines I'll be looking forward to. Obviously, everyone who is going to training camp, hope you have a fun time there. It was incredibly fun when I was there for the week I was in person last year. Got to meet a lot of other Chargers content creators, got to meet a lot of you guys at camp. Won't be going this year just because I'm busy with some stuff back at home. Have to start prepping for some exams and stuff like that pretty soon. I know Steven will be going there for one day, so still a lot of fun to be had, but won't be going myself this year, hopefully next year. But I did want to sort of, again, treat this episode as a primer for all of the stuff that we'll be getting into over the course of training camp and some of the storylines I feel like we'll be talking about and kind of analyzing before we kick off preseason on July 31st. So real football, not actually that far away. So that's always a good thing to hear in July. As far as I put out a Q&A, I'll probably get to some of those questions next week on the episode I do, post training camp practice 1 or 2. So I'll probably do another episode later next week. But again, this episode is a primer while Steven and Tyler are on vacation. I guess I'll do a video on the channel, sort of, to get back into the swing of things. I'm pretty rusty at this, I think, since I haven't done an episode in 2 months. So hopefully it's not terrible. But my first training camp storyline I did want to talk about was, one, Rashawn Slater's extension. So this was obviously a big storyline in OTAs and minicamp. Slater missed OTAs for the first time in his career, and that caused some pandemonium, some panic a little bit on the contract. Are we actually going to get a holdout? But no, he did fully attend minicamp and fully participated in practice, which, when you contrast that with situations around the league, such as Micah Parsons, who attended Dallas Cowboys minicamp but didn't participate, TJ Watt, who skipped, Steelers minicamp entirely, I think gives you a little bit of insight that, the Chargers probably ultimately are in a better place with Slater in negotiations than, two sides that are super far off. And ultimately, I think, the contract has kind of been set by Darrisaw and Penei Sewell last year, both getting 4-year deals, $100+ million. Sewell about $86 million guaranteed, Darrisaw around $77. And so, to me, the thing to watch in this contract negotiation is going to be year-to-year cash flows, injury guarantees, a lot of stuff along those lines, more so than the actual contract numbers. And, the Chargers and Slater, I think, will work out the nitty-gritty of that. Obviously, Slater missed some time in 2022 with a bicep injury, I think 2 or 3 games over the past, couple of years after that. So, I don't think that's going to require him to take less or anything like that. But, I'm sure the Chargers will kind of negotiate again those injury guarantees and how exactly those are going to work with games missed and things of that nature. But again, as Joe Ortiz said, these big contracts, these big deals take time. I ultimately think Slater will fully participate in training camp, as he already kind of indicated in minicamp. And I think this deal does get done probably fairly early on. I don't necessarily want to make an assumption there. Herbert was done around July 23rd. You go back to Derwin, which was like August 22nd on the calendar. Bosa was at the beginning of August, and then you had Keenan, which I think back in 2020 got done right before the season kicked off. So hopefully sooner rather than later. But ultimately, I don't think there's a ton of concern that a deal doesn't get done, at least not yet. The second contract situation that I want to talk about, in number 2 training camp storyline, I think is kind of flying under the radar, is the Trey Harris contract situation, one to watch. So this all started with the second round picks of Cleveland and Houston, right? Carson Schwessinger, as well as Jaden Higgins, got fully guaranteed contracts as second rounders, which were the first in NFL history. And then you have basically 30 other teams, or the 30 other, the other teams that had second round picks went, what? I don't think you were supposed to do that. And so now we have this kind of standoff between second round picks who, feel that they are entitled to that fully guaranteed contract, and owners and front offices being like, nope, we're not going to allow that to happen. Kind of along the lines of what we saw with the Deshaun Watson fully guaranteed contract situation, and then, what the owners and front offices wanted for future quarterback negotiations to make sure that didn't become precedent. So that is going to be a standoff, and that obviously affects Trey Harris, who himself was a second-round pick. For context, Ladd McConkey was actually the latest second-round pick who signed last year around June 17th. And so, this is now carrying on into training camp, potentially into August, that this deal isn't done. Ultimately, I think front offices and owners and player agents kind of start moving when push comes to shove, and training camp hasn't started yet. So I think as training camp starts, as the preseason starts, I do think that's when you're going to see the ball start rolling on who blinks first between these two sides, if you will. But I think the hope, for Trey Harris, who is going to be expected to contribute quite a bit this year, is that it doesn't eat significantly into training camp, significantly into the preseason, regular season. Ultimately, I don't expect it to, but I will be very curious to see what the outcome is, and whether the players are going to get those fully guaranteed contracts, because that doesn't just, mean something for them, but future draft classes going forward, and affect, how we talk about the value of a second round pick and stuff like that, and how owners will treat the draft, front offices and owners will go about the draft going forward. So lot on the line here. Hopefully Trey Harris and the Chargers get a deal sooner rather than later. The center battle is my third positional storyline to talk about. We do have Zion Johnson, Bradley Bozeman, Monday Night Raw. Not really, but I think if you have paid attention to the center battle and how the Chargers have talked about it, they clearly want Zion Johnson to start. Whether that'll end up happening, I don't know, right? Harbaugh went on Chargers Weekly, and this was the quote he sort of gave on the whole thing. And other Chargers coaches have echoed similar sentiments. But the versatility we now have, maybe the combination is going to be better with Zion at center and Bose at guard. But if it's not, we know we have a great combination with Bose at center and Zion at guard. Harbaugh also, I think, had another quote basically kind of giving like a timeline on when he would decide. I think he said 8 to 10 days into training camp is sort of when he expects the battle to be settled. Not that that's like the exact timeline he gave, but as far as when he could have an idea of who was starting, that was sort of what he mentioned. And again, I think this has been, a pretty simply put, an organizational urge to have Zion work there at center, because if he does, you can probably sign him for relatively cheaper as a center than a guard. So there's some financial incentives there if he is actually a good center versus being a good guard. So again, some economics involved there. And I think that ultimately would kind of set how they approach the draft next year, how they approach the offseason, free agency, all these other things, if Zion works there. And if he doesn't, then you have Bradley Bozeman, and, you keep Zion at guard, hope for some more development there. But as a guard, they've already turned down his fifth-year option. That was something they were probably going to do anyway, simply because, as we saw in Baltimore, the situation with Tyler Linderbaum, the finances of having a center on the fifth-year option or having a guard on the fifth-year option are a little pricey than simply extending them. But, I do think this is something that the Chargers are going to try to come out of training camp with some level of confidence with it. And again, like I said, I do think they want Zion to start. Let's see what happens here. And let's also see how confident they feel coming out of training camp. I think that's going to be a big thing too, because let's say Zion starts at center, is that going to be for the whole season, as it was with the offensive line that they projected in June last year, except when Pipkins got hurt and stuff like that? Or is it like, yeah, we tried Zion for the first 4 games, we want to go back to Bradley, right? I think that'll be an interesting dynamic to watch as well, is just how much does Zion really impress at center going forward to the point of earning that job full time, or is he going to be on a bit of a leash in that regard? And they keep continuously mentioning the fact that Bradley Bozeman played left guard in Baltimore, right? I think that's something that, as they keep mentioning that as well, they have an outcome they want. Let's see if it's the outcome they get. My fourth storyline is Justin Herbert, and a healthy Herbert specifically. Now, Herbert missed 2 weeks of training camp last year. He spent, I think, 3 weeks in a boot, and then ultimately, was ready to start the season. Then had the ankle injury that was separate week 2. And Roman talked about this actually on Chargers Weekly, where he said, because of Herbert missing time in that training camp, they had to, quote, bob and weave a little bit. And that's, tough to do in this league, as he said. So, not necessarily that they're installing a whole system this year. The system is largely going to be the same, just going to be different receivers. But even something as simple as Herbert developing chemistry with Trey Harris, Herbert with Oronde Gadsden, Herbert with Keandre, getting Mike Williams and working him back in, right? All these things that we talk about. I think, you want to see a healthy Herbert, obviously, going forward. Nothing that'll linger into the regular season. And ultimately, the most optimal offense from week 1. And I think that's more important this year than it was last year. You're starting with 3 straight divisional games, right? Last year, not that the schedule was easy, so to speak, but you had Raiders, Panthers, and then Steelers. This year, it is Chiefs, Raiders, and Broncos, right? So, I mean, just from a playoff viability standpoint, I think you have more important games, arguably, this year. And if you have a slow offensive start or a couple injuries that, don't go your way, that could, end up being a big deal, or if Herbert has to miss some time. So hopefully, I think Herbert, is able to practice as much as he can in training camp, as much as they see fit. I'm not saying he can't take off days in training camp, like, when they give Khalil Mack veteran off days and stuff like that. I'm sure that will happen, but hopefully no injury to slow the progress of the development of this offense going forward. Experiments is my 5th storyline, and this was actually one of my most interesting things I think I watched at camp last year. I saw a bunch of coaches working with then Charger, now Chicago Bear, Jordan McFadden on the offensive line, and they were trying to get him reps at fullback, give him pointers, do a lot of things in those regards to try to get him ready. Ultimately, it was announced when they made the final roster that Scott Matlock was going to be the starting fullback, and that was interesting because we didn't hear as much about him as we heard about Jordan McFadden, but clearly they were working on getting both of these guys fullback reps. Matlock won that fullback job, and the rest was history. McFadden was waived fairly early on in the year, around like the trade deadline, and then he got picked up by Chicago. So I think how much they are willing to experiment with things, put people in different positions, will be kind of interesting to watch, right? Do you play around with even something like returner and have different guys than Darius Davis or Jalen Reagor returning the ball, right? I think that's going to be interesting to watch. And you can kind of go, throughout the roster and see if there's some guy who maybe otherwise wouldn't make the roster, but if he can show off that versatility and show off the ability, not just like fullback tight end stuff, but if you can prove your versatility on special teams, if you can prove your versatility somewhere else, can you make the roster that way, right? And that's ultimately how Scott Matlock stuck on as like a fullback DT. We'll see how that plays out this year, because I think the Chargers ultimately want him playing offense more than defense, if you listen to Andy Bischoff's comments on it. But we'll kind of see. And if the Chargers have any other experiments that we can't even, predict right now up their sleeves, I think will be an interesting one to watch. My 6th storyline: will the Oronde Gadsden II hype train keep chugging along? Obviously, at OTAs and rookie minicamp, he got, rave reviews from Harbaugh, Andy Bischoff, the team's tight ends coach / run game coordinator. And ultimately had a couple highlight plays with Justin Herbert, with the other quarterbacks, as Daniel Popper and Eric Smith have written about. And I think the real big question is, particularly training camp, in a push comes to shove kind of environment, when the pads come on, can he block well enough? And this is something that my colleague Steven has disagreed with me on when it comes to Oronde, because I was a little higher on Oronde coming out of the draft, I think more so than anyone else involved in GAC, just because I see that his versatility, I think, as someone who's played both wide receiver and tight end, his route running ability, someone who can create some yak plays, some splash plays too. You see that all over his tape. And I was, I think a little bit higher on his athletic upside in that regard. But how much you play in year one of this Charger system, Jim Harbaugh said we have packages, we have plays for you when he was drafted. But I think back to Stone Smart a little bit last year, and one of the reasons why Stone Smart, for example, couldn't see the field particularly often was that Stone Smart had some troubles as a blocker, despite what he was doing. The Kansas City game last year, for example, right? Despite some of the highlight moments he showed, Greg Roman ultimately didn't trust him as a blocker, and that led to kind of a stunting of his development. He ultimately chose to go to the Jets this offseason. So, I'm not saying that Oronde Gadsden is the next Stone Smart, that he's not going to get to play. I think they're going to give him a lot of opportunities given the draft capital that they've invested into him, and the resources that they've invested in him. Everything seems to be going great so far, but I do think the pads coming on will be a big deal for this coaching staff in just how much Oronde is a key player this year versus, okay, he gets some reps, but that's more of a year two thing, right? I do think that this will be a pretty big differentiator for him, but I'm all aboard the Oronde Gadsden hype train. I have been since day one. He was my tight end 6 in the draft. I've been pounding the table for him. Yeah, I know Steven and Tyler weren't as high on his blocking, but that doesn't matter. Anyway, his receiving is really great, and I think he is a willing blocker, and that's something that Andy Bischoff has said also. So we'll see how the Oronde Gadsden hype train keeps going. The defensive line reshuffling is the 7th thing I wanted to talk about today. Now your DT room contains Tier Tart, Otito Ogbonya, Jamari Caldwell, Naquan Jones, Deshaun Hand, Justin Agboigbe. In UDFA, they got Tara Edwards, Josh Fuga, and I think Chris Hinton is also still, on the roster as kind of a, practice squad level replacement player. So this one's going to be interesting to watch just because they've done so much reshuffling. Poona Ford and Morgan Fox obviously both depart, and now you're replacing up to 60 pass rushing pressures there. Obviously, the amount of snaps that they played last year and the influence that they had on this team was pretty big. So how much can these guys kind of step up, and who is the one that steps up the most? Right now, I would put Tier Tart right as your pretty much DT1, but how much does Naquan Jones, Deshaun Hand, Jamari Caldwell in his rookie year, right, factor into this rotation? They've talked up Justin Agboigbe quite a lot as a guy that has put on a lot of weight, done a lot of work in the offseason, was more of a project when they drafted him, but hopefully now has some, positive momentum going into year 2. So I believe them on, all that they said, but which guys kind of rise to the top here is going to be something that I think is particularly evident when the pads do come on in training camp. And I kind of didn't write this down in my notes, but just thinking about it now, edge is going to be different too, right? This is the first offseason really since 2021 that they did not go into it with Khalil Mack and Joey Bosa as, your edge rushers on both sides, and then, do stuff ultimately like kick Thule inside. And right. So now Thule's going to be your primary outside edge. Mack is going to be obviously on the other side. And then, how do they kind of structure the rotation out from there with Kyle Kennard in the mix? I think it'll be interesting to see what they decide to do there. And the DT room being reshuffled and them having to get production from other places. Ultimately, trust Jesse Vinter and this coaching staff completely in how they do that. But it's going to look different than it's looked, particularly in the first year of Harbaugh with Poona Ford and Morgan Fox and Joey Bosa and guys like that in the picture who have now departed. My eighth storyline, Quinton Johnson. I titled this slide, QJ Now or Never. I do think this is a really big year for Quinton Johnson as far as determining his future with the Chargers, as Zion Johnson's fifth-year option was decided last year. QJ's will be decided next year. And ultimately, QJ's 2024, I think, was an improvement. I mean, I don't think anyone can necessarily argue with that with the number of, big games he had against Cleveland, the Raiders, the Carolina game where he caught the touchdown over J.C. Horn, right? We can point to these moments. But I do still think there's a lot of unevenness in his game that needs to be ironed out, right? Obviously, the Texans game, I think, showed some of those limitations. The Ravens game, rather infamous, unfortunately. And the Texans game that happened in the playoffs, again, I think just really put a damper on, okay, is QJ really a guy that now going into year 3, you can, trust to be your primary X receiver on the outside? And as the Chargers have answered this question this offseason, I think the answer is kind of no, right? Obviously, they draft Trey Harris. They bring back Mike Williams, right, in free agency on the cheap. And so I don't think QJ, Daniel Popper for The Athletic has talked about QJ's roster spot being in jeopardy. I don't believe that as much myself, personally. I think QJ is on the team sort of regardless of whether it's a good or bad training camp, but I would say his playing time variance is the term I would use, whether or not he is a consistent starter in the rotation or whether he is a guy that is, sort of between that wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5. I do think that's going to be, dependent on how he performs in training camp, preseason, and the games earlier on in the year. And ultimately, if you're happy with what you have in the receiver room, you don't spend back-to-back second-round picks, on wide receivers and invest. Ultimately, you count the total amount of draft picks they've used on receivers now. It's 3 from the 2024 draft, 2 in the 2025 draft with Keandre Lambert-Smith, Cordelius Johnson, and Brendan Rice last year. So they keep throwing darts at this receiver thing, and whichever ones stick are going to work. And so to me, this is a big opportunity and moment for Quinton Johnson in his Chargers career to determine if a front office that didn't draft him is still going to have kind of the same love for him that, say Tom Telesco did coming out of the draft. And so I think this is a big year for QJ in that regard. Hope for the best for him. We've seen the improvement, but I do think this is a big rubber meets the road kind of year as far as Quinton Johnson's long-term future with the Chargers. UDFAs, obviously a favorite part of free agency and, all the stuff that we talk about every year. The ones that Jim Harbaugh has mentioned by name and Joe Ortiz has talked about, Raheem Sanders, Steve O'Klotz, and Luke Grimm were the other ones that Harbaugh mentioned in particular. Raheem Sanders was the most expensive UDFA they acquired if you look at contractual guarantees at $60,000. So that was kind of interesting to see on Over the Cap. I do have a tough time seeing any of the UDFAs making the roster outright. I think Raheem Sanders clearly has the best chance. Steve O'Klotz probably second in that regard if he's able to beat out Matlock, even though I don't think that's particularly likely to happen this year. Luke Grimm is again the Kansas receiver that Jim Harbaugh mentioned. So we'll see if he can kind of get into the mix with Rager, Brendan Rice, right? That tier of wide receivers on the roster. A couple other names that I like that they signed just to, see if they can get into the rotation here. They did sign a bunch of corners. Eric Rogers, Jordan Olodokun, Miles Purchase, I believe also Nico Reed. So they're definitely looking for some special teams / practice squad depth help there. in regards to those guys. And then Marlo Wax from Syracuse is a guy who's played, I think, 500 special team snaps or something like that in his 4 or 5 years at Syracuse. So definitely a vet who could help them out in that regard. Sanders probably the most likely one to make the roster. Although I do think with how they built out the depth of the roster, I do think an undrafted free agent making it is a little less likely this year than it might have been in years past, simply because of the depth that they've accumulated. And I do think a lot of these guys are probably playing more so for practice squad spots. But as Jim Harbaugh says, competitors welcome. Last thing I wanted to mention was just injury watch. So a lot of players who dealt with injuries. Again, there's no injury report. We don't know how any of these guys are really doing at this stage of the offseason. But a couple of guys, this is from ESPN's Chris Rim, who, when he was at minicamp, basically created a list of players that were working off to the side with injuries to pretty important receivers, Mike Williams and Keandre Lambert-Smith, not particularly active in minicamp. Dean Leonard, Elijah Molden, Miles Burgess, Luke Grimm, and international player pathway tight end Jordan Pataya was another one who was dealing with some injuries during Chargers minicamp. And I think Mike Williams and Keandre Lambert-Smith are obviously the biggest ones to talk about in this regard, just because we've seen Mike deal with injuries quite a bit. Keandre Lambert-Smith is someone that I think has a lot of variability in terms of how he could be used this year. Remember when I talked with Brett Coleman after the draft, he was really high on the Keandre Lambert-Smith pick as sort of a almost quasi like Jalen Guyton replacement, if you wanted to talk about it that way. But obviously, if he's not getting a ton of reps as a 5th-round pick, either due to injury or fitness, as one Sanjay Lal talked about, that's something that's just going to need to, pick up in training camp as we get going here for him to really have involvement in the offensive playbook and the offensive usage in the 2025 season, especially given that Roman's not a big, let's just put 5 receivers out there at a time. That's just not how this offense works a ton. So you would like to see more there. And then a lot of the other guys that have battled injury. I think Cam Hart was another one who was recovering from shoulder surgery at one point. But he was cleared, I think, by minicamp. He was originally dealing with that in OTAs. But ultimately, it seems like all things considered, they are pretty clear of injuries right now, but just a couple guys that they were being conservative on during minicamp that hopefully are ready to go by training camp. And hopefully, obviously, as I mentioned with Herbert earlier, just the most offensive cohesion you can ask for if all of these guys are to be healthy. So that'll do it for me today. That is the 10 storylines that I am watching in Chargers training camp, which gets underway next week. Next week we'll be, back doing an episode every week until the end of the season. This was my sort of comeback episode, if you will. I know Steven and Tyler are going to be back next week too, also covering training camps. So a lot of stuff to get into as we sort of return to doing content on the podcast. So happy to be back. Happy that you guys have watched. And as always, bolt up.